Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about election integrity, and then I will propose a solution to some of the problems. The problem right now stem from the fact that we essentially have a 19th century election and voting system. Not really that much has changed since the 1800s. So first, the larger question. When people talk about stealing an election, what do they mean? The media always focuses on ballot fraud because that's kind of the least common problem. But stealing an election actually can consist of much more than that. Ballot fraud can be a problem, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But they also mean last-minute changes to the voting laws, especially by unauthorized bodies. It's the legislatures that determine the voting laws, and yet in the 2020 election, there were a lot of last-minute changes to the laws and changes made by the judiciary rather than the legislature, which are in legal limbo. The Supreme Court was asked to rule on it, but they did not. They punted. And then, of course, the other thing is deliberate misinformation or suppression. The most obvious example of that being the suppression coordinated amongst many of the major media sources of, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop story just before the 2020 election. But today we're going to focus on ballot fraud. And the first thing that I'll say is that generally large-scale ballot fraud is not common, but it does occur. And I've put a link here that references a story in the Heritage Organization about a significant case of ballot fraud. So how can ballot fraud occur? What are the things that we could do to address that? Well, for starts, we need voter ID. So right now, many states, you can just bring in an electric bill with your name and address on it. Well, anybody with a computer can forge an electric bill for a dead person and go in and be identified as that person. So that's ridiculous. No same-day voter registration. Well, for example, if a party determines that one state is definitely going to go their way, but a neighboring state isn't, then they can just tell people to go over to the other state, and if they have a residence that somebody in the party has arranged, then they can say, okay, you're all 100 of you are going to live in this apartment, give them this address, and there's virtually no way to stop that. You've got a valid address, you move to the state, and then the next day you can move back. Early voting is an issue. It was started because voting only on the Tuesday of election day was very difficult for some people. And especially if they had to work, they might have to wait until after work and then stand in long, long lines, very inconvenient. So they said, well, let's make it more convenient. Let's vote on the weekend and the Monday before election day. Well, now early voting is 6, even 8 weeks ahead of time, and things can happen. Things can change. For example, candidates can die. And if people have already voted, that's too bad. And you may think that this is a hypothetical case, but it isn't. That happened in the 2022 election. There was a fellow from Pennsylvania representative, right?
And it's very bad. I already saw a lot of propaganda in China that they say Americans' American system is going to hell because they already elected a dead person.
And so what that means is that those people, until they can hold a special election for that seat, will have no representation. So that's a bad thing. Mail-in ballots, they need some form of positive ID. They claim that they're going to do signature matching, but that's so difficult. If you sign your name 100 times, it's going to look different 100 ways. And so they have to have very loose algorithms for signature matching. And in fact, I believe that in Georgia, in the runoff election, they just gave up on it altogether and said, well, we're just going to trust that this is the right person's signature. Mail-in ballots. It used to be that they had to arrive by election day because that's when the election was. Now, they're letting them go later and later and later, which results in the complete mess that we have, for example, out in California, where elections don't get called for weeks afterward, and nobody knows who's been elected and how many lawsuits are going to come from that.
I think they are still counting. Election become election months. It just discourages people trust of the system.
You're exactly right. And we need to do something about that. Drop boxes. Before 2020, very few places even used drop boxes. And if you did a mail-in ballot, you mailed it in using a mailbox, which is, as far as I know, available to everyone in the country. So why do we even need drop boxes, and what's wrong with them? Well, the problem with drop boxes is that unlike the mailbox, which has mail of all different kinds, drop boxes only have ballots. So they make great targets if you are someone who wants to perpetrate a fraud, either by stealing ballots or by stuffing ballots into drop boxes. So they at least need monitoring, and I'm not sure why we really need them at all. Ballot harvesting. That's where someone goes around and collects lots of ballots from people who they claim have voted legally, but you don't know that. They could go around to an apartment or an old folks' home, and they could take the mail-in ballots that the people have not yet filled out, take them, fill them out themselves, forge a name onto it, and if the signature matching requirements aren't there, then they can just take all of those ballots, which are perfectly legal ballots, which will be tracked by the system as being valid, and they can put whatever they want onto them. So ballot harvesting should not be allowed. Voter rolls. People die after each election. People move after each election. And yet the voter rolls rarely get updated. Here in Virginia, for example, my son and daughter moved away from home when they went to college. And for years afterward, we would get voter registration requests from the state of Virginia for these people because they didn't know that they had moved. They didn't know that they were voting elsewhere. So if they'd been willing to take the risk, they could have registered in Virginia and wherever else they lived. And it would have been very difficult to track down.
Especially nowadays, there's one side use all their power, the propaganda machine or the media, social media, to let people believe that American has a Hitler is trying to take the White House. That could encourage a lot of people to think they're doing the right thing. So even they do some illegal voting, we cannot measure how many people really fall into those kind of narrative and do something risk.
No, you're exactly right. They justify it because they are saving democracy, but they aren't. They're perverting it. So what's the best system currently? Well, the best system is in-person voting using a paper ballot that you mark with a pen or a marker and then put into an electronic tabulation machine. So now you have constantly updated count of the ballots and the election results, but you also have a paper trail so that if the results get challenged, you can go back and audit it, and there should be an exact match between the electronic records and the actual paper ballots. And then another one that I'm concerned about is runoff elections. In Georgia in 2020, and the runoff election for actually 2 Senate seats were not held until January 5th of 2021. And in between, a number of new registrants came in and registered. And that was sufficient to put both of the Democrats over the line, who had, at least in one case, not been the majority vote getters in the original election. And the question is, how do we know that those new registrants were actually Georgia residents? They already voted in the general election, and now they have until the 6th of December to register in Georgia. You could envision busloads of students being brought down, given common apartment addresses, and then being registered in the Georgia system, and then going out and voting, and then going home the next day. And there's nothing that they could have done about it. So that needs to be fixed.
Those are very good points. I like all of them, but because the election is more about a state, each state decide their election system. The hard part is to pass a new law to fix the broken election system.
Well, let me propose something to you. And this is a radical suggestion. You may not like it, but I will put it on the table so that it can be explored. So let me show you a radical suggestion. So, by background,